Welcome to our review of the Stellar Headless Guitar Kit. Firstly, I should stress that this is not a step-by-step guide to building a kit guitar. A step-by-step guide would be a very long video, and as we'll see, there is an argument that if you need a step-by-step guide, you shouldn't really be attempting to build a kit guitar. The first thing you need to know is that with this and many other kits, there are no assembly instructions. Guitar kit manufacturers have yet to take a leaf out of IKEA's book. I had to overcome a number of challenges in assembling the guitar, so if you have some woodworking experience and fancy building a kit, you will find some useful tips in this video. The video is divided up into convenient sections. Whilst it isn't a step-by-step guide, we really get into the weeds in some sections, so you can skip ahead and see the sections that matter to you if you want. There are links to each section in the description below. In this video we cover why build a headless guitar kit, guitar specifications, guitar assembly, lacquer finish, final assembly, guitar setup, testing and conclusions. So why build a headless kit guitar? I just wanted a compact headless guitar to noodle on around the house to take with me on holiday. I spotted this guitar kit on Amazon about 5 years ago, and it has sat waiting to be assembled and finished ever since. The 2020 COVID-19 lockdown gave me the chance to complete this and other projects. Chinese manufacturers often produce white label products which can then be branded by a variety of Western companies. I found the identical kit to this one on the BY Guitars website, where it's called the GK SHS11. BY Guitars bill themselves as the leading manufacturer of guitar kits in China and are based in Shandong, northeast China. My particular guitar was branded Stellar, but was obviously made by BY Guitars. I don't think that Stellar is in business any longer, but you can buy this Chinese made kit from other suppliers, so I thought that it was well worth building it and documenting it. I should say here that I bought and paid for the guitar and materials, and no one has paid me to do this review. I have scratch built electric guitars for many years. Here is an example. So I have more experience and probably more equipment than most in sorting out technical challenges. And as we'll see, I needed plenty of both. The guitar has the following key specifications. The body is made from 4 pieces of figured ash. It has a bolt-on figured maple neck with a rosewood fretboard. It's difficult to show in photographs, but the neck has a subtle flame figuring virtually its entire length. Scale length is 25.5 inches or 648mm, which is like a Fender Strat. Nut width is 42mm. It has 1 humbucker and 2 single coil pickups. It has 1 volume and 1 tone control with a 5-way sliding selector switch. It has an Overlord of Music tremolo tailpiece patterned after the Steinberger Guitars Headless R Trem. There are a couple of things to note here if you want to upgrade the pickups. Chinese humbuckers and their rings are slightly wider and longer than the American originals, so if you're going to upgrade the hardware you need to bear this in mind. Furthermore, the string spacing on a vintage Strat tremolo is 56mm wide, E string to E string, and on a modern Strat it's 52mm. However, the Overlord of Music tremolo is 50.6mm, so the guitar will need standard space pickups, not F-space pickups. I had wanted to do a comparison between the supply pickups and the one I have chosen to fit, but I discovered early on that because of differences in dimensions that would be impossible, and so I have had to complete the guitar ready to accept my chosen pickups. It's important to state at this point that this particular kit came with many but not all of the screw holes already drilled. As we'll see, this has pluses and minuses. So what's the first step in assembling the guitar? Long experience has taught me that unless you are careful, components will pick up marks and dirt along the way which can spoil the finished article. The first thing I did therefore was to protect the neck by masking off the fretboard, lightly sanding the back and then spraying satin nitrocellulose lacquer. Having protected the maple neck, I could then remove the masking tape and apply oil to the fretboard. Don't try to oil the fretboard first, because if you get any on the neck, the lacquer won't stick properly. The body end of the fretboard had been left rough cut, so I carefully rounded the corners using a drum sander. Don't try and do this by eye. I put masking tape on the fretboard end and marked the radii to follow using a radius template. I then put the neck to one side. The first thing that was obvious about the body is that the routes for both the tremolo and the humbucker were quite poor. It took quite a lot of time and effort to correct these faults. The most important issue is the tremolo bridge. It must be aligned correctly with the neck, otherwise the guitar will be unplayable. Fitting the tremolo to the guitar for the first time, it became obvious that the central route to accommodate the tremolo spring had been cut way too wide, and one of the rear retaining screws cracked what remained of the wood on the bass side. This created a certain amount of paranoia. What if the tremolo was out of alignment with the neck? The position of the tremolo was checked by screwing the neck to the body, placing adhesive tape at the nut and tail ends of the fretboard and finding the centre line. This was then lined up with the centre of the tremolo using a straight edge. Fortunately, the tremolo was in alignment with the neck and it was also square to the centre line. Mercifully, the manufacturers had got that bit right. However, the route had to be filled in and trimmed to provide a snug fit for the tremolo bass. For anyone who is tempted to use fiberglass filler, it won't be strong enough. Gibson uses 2 half-inch diameter by 1-inch deep bushes to retain their tailpieces. Fender uses 6 wood screws to retain the tremolo plate and 2 large wood screws to retain the tremolo springs. The Overlord of Music tremolo uses only 4 wood screws, and without the repair, one of them wouldn't even be screwed in. It was therefore decided to glue in strips of ash veneer to match the bodywood and a strip of aluminium for good measure. The gap had to be filled in by 3mm on the bass side, which meant 1 layer of 1.6mm veneer and 1 strip of 1.5mm aluminium. The treble side had to be filled in with 1.6mm strip of ash veneer. It has to be said that a machining variation of 4.5mm is really quite serious. A big problem was, how do you clamp the veneer and aluminium while they're being glued? The narrow gap and curved shape of the body presented a challenge for conventional clamps. You can use wedges, but I've found them difficult to control. I therefore decided to use nylon bolts and threaded bushes. You just insert them into the gap and then expand them, which clamps the veneer against the wall of the route. Titebond adhesive was used for the ash veneer, and Araldite epoxy resin was used for the aluminium strip. After some sanding, the tremolo had now become a snug fit in its channel and remained properly aligned with the neck following the repair. The route on the front edge of the tremolo and the humbucker were merely unsightly. I wanted to straighten them up, and that was done using Ron-Seal 2-part fiberglass filler. Using dams fashioned from 1-inch aluminium angle, fiberglass was smeared on the inside of the routes and moulded using the dams. These give a nice clean edge. You have to remember to cover the dams with adhesive tape to prevent the fiberglass sticking to the aluminium, and I use packaging tape for this. For the long tremolo and humbucker edges, I use clamps and double-sided tape to keep the dams in place while the fiberglass set. The route for the bridge humbucker was too far over to the bass side. This was also filled in using the fiberglass and dam technique. I managed to get away with just double-sided tape to secure the dams. I cut the proper size of route for a US made humbucker using a handheld router, a bearing guided cutter and a template. For playing comfort, the front edge of the body really needs to be rounded over. As supplied, the body had sharp corners, so these were rounded over using a drum sander in a drill press. Again, use a template to mark out the required profile. Don't try and do it by eye. When everything had been tidied up, it was time to assemble the guitar to make sure everything fitted. One issue became apparent. Bolt-on neck plates are made to fit Fender style guitars, which have a slightly wider bridge and neck string spacing. With the plastic sock fitted to the neck plate, it was slightly proud of the body, which was exactly the right size for the neck. This would require some careful trimming. I had already decided that I would replace the supplied pickups with better pickups and the electronics with US made electronics. The supplied pickups and electronics are not of great quality. They are okay to give to a young friend who may be making guitar as a school project, but I wouldn't want to have to rely on them for anything more serious. This means ensuring that the US made parts fit properly. As an example, the potentiometer holes have to be enlarged. When you enlarge holes in wood, the ideal way to do it is with a reamer to avoid the possibility of a drill grabbing and breaking the wood. Before drilling the holes for the pickup mounting rings, string up the guitar and align the pickup pole pieces with the strings. They won't be a perfect match, but you need to get them as near as. I happen to already have a Kent Armstrong HPAN1 path style humbucker and 2 StewMax strap pickups available, which are of American dimensions. Another issue that emerged was the position of the pickup selector switch. Once I assembled the guitar, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was just far too close to the volume knob. I therefore resolved to move it to a more comfortable place. The challenge would be, how do I hide the unsightly filler marks which would show where the selector switch had been? I had already decided that I needed to disguise where the tremolo and humbucker routes had been repaired, so this was merely an extension of that process. Firstly, to maintain the structural integrity of the control cavity, I filled in the slot and screw holes by gluing in solid wood and then used filler scraped level with the top to get a smooth finish. To disguise a filler used on the switch repair and other routes, I then used water-based acrylic paints to paint in the wood grain. Once the body is spray painted with a colour, it should be difficult if not impossible to see where the repairs were. You will be able to judge for yourself. If you want a cheap basic finish, then an oil finish is the way to go, but bear in mind that you can only do a natural oil finish unless you stain the wood. And there are challenges in staining the wood. On this particular guitar, the manufacturer had smeared glue across the upper bout, which would leave an unsightly patch if you tried to stain it. And of course I wanted to modify the body, which meant that you would see unsightly marks where the body had been filled. You could just paint the body with a solid colour, but that would be a shame given the attractive grain of the wood. I therefore decided to coat the guitar with a transparent coloured finish to highlight the attractive ash wood grain. The easiest finish to apply would be a traditional nitrocellulose lacquer finish applied using aerosol cans. I have spray equipment, but it's really painful having to clean everything out after blowing over one body, so for convenience I went with aerosols. At this point, you have to realise that although you want a decent finish, it's never going to be as good as a factory finish. You might be tempted by 2K finishes because they build much faster than nitrocellulose, but strictly speaking, you should wear forced air breathing equipment when spraying 2K. So it seemed far more sensible to take my time, wear a good quality paint spray mask and steadily build up the coats of nitrocellulose lacquer. Ash definitely needs to be grain filled, so I use Rustin's natural grain filler. It's then a good idea to use a sanding sealer coat. I found, like everyone else, that ash is very absorbent, and so the sanding sealer reduces the amount of gloss lacquer that you need to use. I then sprayed the body with clear gloss lacquer. Despite my best efforts, I could still see some depressions and holes in the finish where the nitrocellulose had been absorbed too much. I therefore drop filled nitrocellulose using a cocktail stick and some nitrocellulose lacquer. You need to leave it for 2 or 3 days to harden before sanding the lacquer flat. Unless you are prepared to apply a lot of finish, you are not going to get a glass-like finish with ash. I therefore sprayed until I had got a reasonably smooth finish before applying the colour coat. With regards to the colour coat, I found a particularly attractive turquoise finish at the Manchester Guitar Tack website. Although it's sold as a blue finish, it's one of those finishes that can look green, blue or turquoise depending on the density of the finish and the light, and I absolutely love it. So much so that I used it on 2 guitars. I discovered that this Staedtler highlighter pen is an exact colour match for the blue tinted lacquer. Where there were minor imperfections in the lacquer, I was able to touch them in with this pen and then go over with clear lacquer. It is important not to try and sand down the colour coat, as you stand a really good chance of just rubbing through it, at which point you enter a world of pain. Use a tack rag to remove stray dust and particles and give it a few coats of clear lacquer before even considering approaching the guitar with a piece of wet and dry paper. Once you've sprayed gloss lacquer, and when you think the lacquer is thick enough, leave the guitar for a minimum of 2 weeks for the finish to harden. I should say here that over a period of 2 weeks the lacquer will shrink slightly. I was prepared to accept some imperfections, so I went straight to the sanding and buffing as follows. Wet sand with 800 grit wet and dry. Don't forget to soak the paper in water overnight. Real purists would soak the paper in paraffin. It doesn't cause any swelling of the wood, while water might if any screw holes have any bare wood in them, and it doesn't load up as badly. However, I don't enjoy the experience, so I stick with water. Follow up by wet sanding with 1500 grit wet and dry. Make sure the paper is soaked overnight too. Buff with a buffing cream. I use 3M Ultra Finish compound applied with muslin. Follow up with a finer buffing cream. I use 3M Finesse It. Finish off with a really fine buffing cream. I use 3M's Imperial Hand Glaze. I have had these 3M buffing creams in stock for many years. Use a tiny amount on a guitar, and so they just last for a very long time. While it may be quicker and easier to use machine buffing, I bear the scars of burning through a cellulose finish with a machine buffer and having to start again, so I would recommend doing it all by hand. It took me about an hour. Not so much of a sacrifice after all the many hours spent so far. It is difficult to achieve a consistent colour with aerosols, but I am reasonably happy with the finish. I managed to chip the finish somehow on the back of the lower bass bout. This had to be repaired, and it is very difficult to get a perfect repair on a tinted lacquer finish. I used a car painting technique to try and blend in the repair. I put some blue tack on the edge of the guitar to hold my spray mask away from the body. I then put a spray mask with a hole just larger than the patch onto the blue tack. When you spray through the hole distance from the body, it gives a soft edge to the repair rather than a hard edge. You can see here the result of the repair. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. Before I finished the guitar, I had already assembled and strung it up, although I hadn't connected the electronics. You don't want to find that things don't fit once you've spent many hours spraying and buffing the guitar. After I polished the guitar, the first assembly task was attaching the base of the tremolo. Something very important was omitted by the manufacturer. It is vital that you earth or ground the tremolo and hence the strings if you want to avoid annoying buzzing noises. I drilled a hole from the trem route through to the control route. To make sure that there is proper electrical contact between the tremolo bridge and the ground wire, I scratched off the paint around the screw hole on the base of the tremolo. I used an eyelet soldered onto the ground wire and placed this under the tremolo base before screwing it in place. I then soldered the other end to the back of the volume pot. There is another point to watch here. When you are grounding or earthing wires in a guitar circuit, only do it to one point, usually the volume pot, or you run the risk of creating a ground loop which will make the guitar noisy. I had this problem on a guitar a long time ago, and it took me a while to work out what the problem was. The next thing to do is to attach the tremolo to the bass. This is easier said than done, and I recommend wearing eye protection. I didn't, and on an early attempt ended up with a tremolo component hitting me in the face. Essentially what you have to do is this. A. Screw in the spring tensioning screw a little, just enough to balance the spring end cap in place. B. You then put the spring in place over the end cap. When you're happy it's properly seated, then C. Place the other end of the spring in the cup retainer cast into the base of the tremolo, marked here. Then D. You then need to squeeze the tremolo back and down so that you can engage the knife edges, marked here, into the pivot points in the tremolo base. It's quite tricky the first time you do it, but it all happens quite easily after that. Just another tip on this tremolo. The spring tensioning screw is only M4, 4mm in outer diameter and only 3.3mm in minimum diameter. The equivalent screw on the original Steinberger trem is thicker, probably M6. I tried to tension the spring without properly seating it and ended up bending this screw, and it wasn't that hard to do. Once you're happy with the tremolo, attach the neck. It's then time to install the pickups and the electrics. Rather than try and assemble the electrics in the guitar body, I like to assemble them on a piece of plywood drilled for exactly the right dimensions between components. This gives you much more space to work. I used a circuit diagram from the Bare Knuckle Pickups website, which gives you the following pickup combinations. Position 1, bridge. Position 2, bridge slug coil and middle pickup. Position 3, middle pickup. Position 4, middle pickup and neck pickup. Position 5, neck pickup. Having installed the control circuit, it should then be a straightforward matter to install the pickups and solder the leads in place. Now comes stringing the guitar up. The Overlord of Music tremolo attracts some criticism, but it's not a bad unit when it's properly set up, and it is way cheaper than alternatives, even if you can find them. Something you will notice is its weight. The tremolo bridge, complete with arm and screws, weighs 619 grams, which is nearly a fifth the weight of the entire guitar. Stringing the guitar has to be done quite carefully. Firstly, the Overlord of Music tremolo, which came with this guitar, was unlubricated. So I unscrewed each of the string tuners in turn and lubricated them with bike grease. You will find this makes a heck of a difference to how easy it is to turn the tuners. To install a string, unscrew the string tensioner until the claw for the string's ball end is just open enough to insert a ball end. Tighten the tensioner just enough that you can't pull the ball out, perhaps 1 to 1.5 turns. Then thread the other end of the string through the double locking nut. Pull hard on the string and tighten the individual string clamp shown here as string clamp 1. This holds the string in place. Once you have installed 2 strings side by side, tighten up the double string clamp shown here as string clamp 2. This provides an adequate break angle across the 0 fret to allow the string to be played cleanly. I managed to get the guitar all together and test it through an amp. I felt that something was missing, a pickguard. I like the Fender Cabronita Telecaster style of pickguard, so I designed and made one for the guitar. I think it's a great finishing touch. Now we come to setting the guitar up. When you tighten up the tuners at the bridge end, you need to make sure that the bridge is locked in place. The lock is the flat-shaped piece of metal attached to the bass side of the bass, which pivots up to engage with a catch attached to the bottom of the tremolo. You need to install all the strings, tune them to pitch and then release the lock. Like the Steinberger trem on which it's based, the Overlord of Music trem mainspring clamp is adjusted so that the string pitches either locked or unlocked are the same. On this particular guitar the lock is quite loose, which is apparently a common fault. When you first string the guitar up, you will probably need to leave the guitar a day or two to see how the neck reacts to the string tension. This guitar uses a simple style of truss rod common on Chinese manufactured instruments. It is simply 2 rods welded together at one end with an adjustment nut at the other. When the 2 rods are put under compression as the nut is tightened, they are forced apart, which has the effect of opposing the force placed on the neck by the string tension. It's not as elegant a solution as the designs used by Gibson and Fender, but it works. If the neck relief is too much, then sit down, bend the neck back against your thigh, and then gently tighten the nut. Just tighten by 1/4 of a turn at a time. By bending the neck with your hands, you stand less chance of stripping the nut. Attach a capo at the 1st fret and fret the guitar at the neck to body junction. In this instance, it's the 17th fret. Then check the gap between the bottom of the string and the top of the 8th fret. You can check it with a feeler gauge and it should be about 0.1/1000 of an inch as a guide. Once you are sure that the neck has stopped moving and it has the correct amount of relief, then you can think about setting the string heights and intonation. The height of the tremolo is fixed unless you place shims under the bass. All the string height adjustment is done by altering the height of the bridge pieces. The first thing you must do is loosen the bridge piece clamp so that you can move the bridge pieces. You heighten or lower the bridge pieces using an Allen key. You alter the intonation by moving the bridge pieces backwards or forwards with your fingers. I adjusted the string height to 2 mm above the 12th fret on the bass side and 1.6 mm on the treble side. It was straightforward to adjust the intonation. Clamp up the bridge pieces back up once you're happy with everything. Here is the specification of the guitar as it ended up. Testing. So how does it play and sound? I had strung the guitar up and strummed it a few times. I had then assembled it and strummed it a few more times. Having done everything I needed to do, I decided to give it a thorough test, and this is where another fault made its presence known. The guitar wouldn't stay in tune, and the reason was the strings were slipping in the double locking nut. The strings are held in place by 6 mm long M5 cut point grub screws. Unfortunately, where the grub screws are inserted into the nut, it is not threaded all the way to the bottom, and so the grub screws cannot grip the strings tightly enough. I saw a suggestion online as to how to cure the problem. Either insert a 3mm diameter ball bearing into each hole or use dog nose grub screws. I decided to go with the latter solution because it seemed more sound engineering wise. The holes for the grub screws are 9mm deep, but the grub screws are only 6mm long. To minimise the possibility of the threads being stripped, I bought 10mm dog nose grub screws, which use the full length of the screw holes, and install them. The first time I tried them, I still had a problem with the B and high E strings slipping. I therefore roughed up the ends of the screws where they contacted the strings, and that seemed to cure the problems with the B string. However, the E string was still slipping. Out of desperation, I tried a ball bearing as well as a dog nose grub screw in the nut, but no dice, it was still slipping. This was getting serious. I looked at grub screws in depth, and there is quite a range of them. Fortunately, they are really cheap, so it was possible to experiment with them. You can see here the 3 further types I bought to try: cone point, flat point, cup point. I tried the flat point first, but again no dice. I then tried the longer cup point. It's 10mm long instead of the 6mm of the original, and voila, it worked. For this video I am just concentrating on demoing the guitar without using the tremolo, and the guitar stays in tune when used like this. How is it to play? As installed, the nut does provide a break angle over the 0 fret, but only just, so it's a bit buzzy on the frets. I actually like the profile of the neck, which is a comfortable C profile. Access to the upper frets is great. I was worried that the frets would need to be levelled, but in the event the guitar plays fine with an acceptable action. The guitar sounds fine to me, but that is down to my selection of the pickups and the electronics. The manufacturer cannot really take any credit for that. Here is what the guitar sounds like in position 1, the humbucker, position 2, the humbucker and middle pickup, position 3, the middle pickup, position 4, the middle and neck pickups, position 5, the neck pickup. All guitar parts were recorded using my trusty Mua GE200. So was it all worth it? If you're looking for a cheap way into electric guitar ownership, frankly there are much better alternatives. Amazon no longer sell the stellar version of this guitar, but you can buy a very similar model for £155 at the present time. By comparison, you could buy a complete, ready-to-go Harley Benton HSS Strat for just £68 plus £8 shipping. Or you could buy a Squier Strat for £118, which includes shipping. So why build a guitar? There are two reasons really. Firstly, the fun of building the guitar. I enjoyed it hugely. Secondly, the opportunity to customise the guitar to your taste. I am knocked out by how the guitar has turned out. What are the challenges of building something like this? Non-existent or poor instructions. Manufacturing faults. It was surprising that the manufacturer made such a hash of the easy stuff, like routing out the trem and pickup routes, when they did the more difficult stuff like the neck carve and fretting really well. Tools. You need access to a reasonably well-equipped workshop to undertake the remedial work. Time. It took many hours, over 3 months or so, to build a guitar, but hey, it was fun. Cost. I had the pickups lying around from another project, but I spent about £40 on replacing the electronics, knobs and jack plate. I spent about another £40 on lacquer, but you could get away with an oil finish like True Oil, which a lot of people like. That's probably just £10. Case. Lastly, don't forget that it doesn't come with a case or a gig bag. You will also find that cases of the right size are really difficult to source at a reasonable price. However, it will fit a Strat gig bag or case, and so for say £20 you can source something to keep it safe when you're not using it. If I had any advice for BY guitars, it would be this. Provide instructions. Lots of other companies do it for a very wide range of products. Accurate machining. From their website it is obvious that they have computer controlled machinery. However, it looks like some of the machining was done using a handheld router. Badly. They need to ensure that all machining is done to commonly accepted tolerances, probably using computer controlled machining throughout. Finish. In a factory environment, spraying a finish is relatively low cost. To make it much easier to assemble, they could consider offering, say, a natural finish body that you can spray over with whatever colour you like to customise the guitar. Dump the cheap electronics. If they machined the body to accept US made parts and forgot the cheap Chinese stuff, they would be doing everyone a favour. I would gladly swap these parts for a pre-finished guitar. Upgraded tremolo bridge. I get that the overlord of music is made down to a price, but the corners that have been cut are really counterproductive. A larger diameter spring tensioning screw would cost pennies more. A little more care with the finish wouldn't cost much more. A better cut bridge clamp wouldn't cost much more. Wider double locking nut. Although the nut is only marginally slimmer at 42mm than the generally accepted nut width of 43mm, because of its design the string spacing is 1mm narrower than usual, making the string spacing feel slightly cramped. Lastly, they should throw in a gig bag. So there we have it. I'm looking forward to my next project.